Paul Newman was the only man who ever made me fear myself. Those trembling words, whispered by Elizabeth Taylor in her final interview before death, fell like a quiet thunder across Hollywood. For decades, she had been the very definition of glamour, the violet-eyed goddess of the silver screen, the woman who had survived 8 marriages, scandals, heartbreaks, and triumphs. But in the end, it wasn't any of her husbands she spoke of. It was her co-star, Paul Newman, two of the most flawless icons of their century, both worshipped by millions, both adored by the camera, yet bound by a secret so dangerous, so human, it haunted her until her dying breath. The world had long believed they were nothing more than colleagues, two stars orbiting in separate galaxies of fame. But behind the dazzling lights of Cat on a hot tin roof, beneath the layers of performance and perfection, something else burned, something neither of them dared to name, a feeling too deep to act, too real to deny. Elizabeth Taylor carried that secret for more than half a century, like a wound that never healed. And when she finally spoke, even her silence told the world a story more tragic than any movie she ever made. So what was the terrible truth that Elizabeth Taylor kept hidden from Hollywood? And why did she wait until her final days to reveal it? It was 1957, Hollywood's golden age. The theaters along Sunset Boulevard blazed every night, their lights reflecting off faces too perfect to seem real. In that glittering world of gossip and grandeur, 2 names rose above all others, Elizabeth Taylor and Paul Newman. She was 25, already a reigning queen of MGM, the violet of Hollywood, with eyes of amethyst and a beauty that could hush an entire room. But behind that perfection was a heart weighed down by grief. Her marriage to actor Michael Wilding had ended in failure, and the tragic death of her 3rd husband, producer Mike Todd, in a plane crash the following year, left her shattered and numb. Her world had collapsed until fate handed her a script, Cat on a hot tin roof. It wasn't just a role, it was a lifeline. At the same time, Paul Newman, 33, was emerging as Hollywood's newest enigma. A rising star from Warner Brothers, he was nothing like the others, modest, disciplined, faithful. While his peers indulged in affairs and whiskey-soaked nights, Newman preferred quiet dinners with his wife, Joanne Woodward, the actress he had just married earlier that year. They called him the man who didn't belong to Hollywood. And yet destiny, that invisible hand that rewrites even the best scripts, would pull him straight into its most dangerous story. After James Dean's untimely death, MGM scrambled to find a replacement for the leading role in Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. They needed a man with depth, someone whose eyes could carry the pain of Tennessee Williams' tortured character, Brick Pollitt. They chose Paul Newman. Then came the question of Maggie, the fiery, desperate wife. The director, Richard Brooks, said quietly, "No one can play a woman burning with desire better than Elizabeth Taylor." And so, in the fall of 1957, under the blazing California sun, Elizabeth Taylor and Paul Newman met for the first time at the MGM studios in Culver City. Witnesses said she was trying on her costume, a tight white silk dress that seemed to capture light itself, when Newman walked in. She turned, smiled, and said softly, "Hello, Brick." Newman froze. Later he admitted that in that moment he forgot every line from the script. It was as if something unseen had passed between them. Not fire, not noise, but a quiet current strong enough to unsettle even the calmest soul. She was the flame that longed for warmth. He was the ice that feared melting. In a world built on performances, fate had cast them in a story more real than either of them could control. January 1958. Inside MGM Studios, the air was thick, not with a smoke or lights, but with something invisible, electric. The set of Cat on a Hot Tin Roof had become a battlefield of desire and restraint. The scene, a stifling bedroom. The characters, Brick and Maggie, a husband and wife trapped in silence, burning beneath the same roof. Paul Newman sat motionless on the bed, eyes cold, distant. Elizabeth Taylor entered, heels clicking like a metronome of tension. The camera rolled. The script said Maggie was to touch her husband's shoulder. A simple, rehearsed gesture. But that night, something changed. When Taylor's hand reached him, the set went still. Crew members held their breath. Newman didn't react as planned. He turned his face away, inhaled sharply, as if fighting something no one could see. The director, Richard Brooks, didn't say cut. He just whispered, keep going. When the scene ended, the silence was deafening. Taylor stood frozen. Newman walked off set without a word. A crew member later said, Paul could control everything except himself when she was near. From that moment on, the atmosphere shifted. Whenever the cameras rolled, their chemistry ignited, raw, magnetic, dangerous. But when the lights went out, he kept his distance, retreating behind invisible walls. Taylor, used to men falling at her feet, felt something new, rejection. He's so cold, she murmured to the director. But behind that coldness, something's burning. Brooks smirked. You two don't need to act. You are Brick and Maggie. And indeed, every glance, every silence between them became so charged that even the film crew began to whisper, was it still acting? Or had the story slipped off the screen and into real life? When Cat on a Hot Tin Roof premiered months later, audiences were spellbound. Critics hailed it as one of the greatest portrayals of passion ever captured on film. The tension, the longing, the pain, it all felt too real. Hollywood began to wonder what really happened when the cameras stopped rolling. When the film wrapped, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof became a sensation. 6 Oscar nominations. 2 for Best Actor and Actress, Paul Newman and Elizabeth Taylor. But what the world couldn't stop talking about wasn't the film. It was them. Something between them felt too intimate, too alive to be just performance. Even in interviews, they seemed unable to hide that subtle current, a kind of ache that neither fame nor professionalism could disguise. At the time, Elizabeth Taylor was emerging from tragedy. Only months earlier, she had buried her husband, Mike Todd, after his plane went down in flames. She hadn't eaten, hadn't slept, and refused to see anyone. When MGM offered her the role of Maggie, she didn't accept for the money. She accepted to survive. For Paul Newman, life was far simpler, at least from the outside. He had just married Joanne Woodward, Hollywood's picture of grace and loyalty. They were adored, the golden couple everyone envied. Yet even the golden man of Hollywood would later admit, fidelity isn't only about resisting temptation, it's about controlling your emotions. And that control was slipping. During press tours, they were always seated together, and every camera seemed to capture the tension between them. Elizabeth would tease, "If I were Maggie, would you still run away?" Newman smiled faintly, eyes betraying something fragile and forbidden. At the 1959 Oscars, she appeared in a white silk gown, glowing, serene, untouchable. When she walked up to him backstage, she whispered, "I wish Mike were here to see this." Newman, still in that polished calmness, replied, "If he were, I think he'd be proud, but maybe a little jealous." They both laughed, but only for a moment, long enough for a photographer to snap the picture that would haunt tabloids for weeks. Whenever asked about her connection to Newman, Elizabeth's answer was always the same: "We're just friends." But in Hollywood, "just friends" is the most dangerous phrase of all. Years later, she would confess to a journalist, "There are eyes that make you forget who you are. Paul Newman's are one of them." And when Newman was asked about Taylor, he said softly, "She's too strong. I'm afraid that if I take one more step, we'd both lose ourselves." That wasn't just a line. It was a confession wrapped in fear. From then on, he avoided her at parties, interviews, premieres. Yet whenever she entered a room, his composure faltered, his smile stiffened, his eyes drifted toward her as if against his will. Elizabeth, curious and wounded, once joked to Montgomery Clift, "He drives me mad, not because I want him, but because I can't understand how he can be so cold." But the truth was, he wasn't cold. He was terrified, because what they shared went beyond lust or admiration. It was the kind of connection that could destroy two lives at once. And so they both chose silence, a silence that grew heavier with every passing year. Hollywood, summer of 1958. The editing for Cat on a Hot Tin Roof was nearly finished. Elizabeth Taylor and Paul Newman were still required to attend test screenings, publicity photo shoots, and interviews side by side. By then, their connection had become undeniable. It was no longer a flicker of curiosity. It was a quiet fire that frightened them both. During one interview, when asked what she thought of her co-star, Elizabeth smiled faintly and said, "He makes me forget I'm acting." And when Newman was asked about her, he only muttered one word: "Dangerous." But she wasn't dangerous because she tempted him. She was dangerous because she made him realize how vulnerable he truly was. One night in early June, MGM held a small private celebration at the Beverly Hills Hotel to toast the film's success. The ballroom shimmered with laughter, champagne, and cigarette smoke. Taylor and Newman sat at opposite ends of the long table, avoiding each other's eyes, yet every movement, every glance, seemed to pull them closer. When the party ended and the last flashbulb faded, Taylor returned to her quiet apartment on North Crescent Drive. She was removing her makeup when a knock echoed at the door. Outside stood Paul Newman. His white shirt was wrinkled, his expression solemn. She froze. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "I know," he said softly, "but I need to say this before we pretend it never existed." They sat in his silence, facing each other in the dim light. No cameras, no dialogue. Only two people who had spent months hiding behind their characters, now exposed. Newman spoke slowly, his voice low, trembling just enough to betray the truth beneath it. "If I didn't have Joanne, I don't think I'd leave this room." Taylor looked at him, those clear blue eyes filled with something between longing and regret. After a long pause, she replied, "And because you have Joanne, you have to go." He didn't argue. He stood up, walked toward the door, and before leaving, turned back for one last look. The kind of look that would live in her memory for the rest of her life. Later, in her private journal, Elizabeth wrote, "I lived many more years, but no one ever looked at me like that again." The next morning, they met again at an MGM photo shoot. Cameras clicked, smiles were perfect. The world saw two professionals, flawless, untouchable. No one could have guessed that only hours earlier they had stood on the very edge of love and conscience. That night would become her most beautiful and most merciless memory. Beautiful because I finally knew what love was. Merciless because I had to let it go. After that night, they never spoke of it again. The film premiered, the world applauded, and both Elizabeth Taylor and Paul Newman ascended to untouchable heights of fame. But behind the perfection, they carried something the cameras could never capture, a memory too fragile to name. Paul Newman returned to his wife, Joanne Woodward, the woman who had stood beside him since the beginning. Together, they built a life far away from Hollywood's noise. A farmhouse in Westport, Connecticut, filled with children, laughter, and peace. Newman found purpose beyond acting. He started Newman's Own, a food brand that donated all profits to charity. The world called him the kindest man in Hollywood, and he lived up to that name. Loyal, humble, and forever devoted to Joanne. Elizabeth Taylor's path was the opposite. After Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, her fame became a storm. She married Eddie Fisher, the best friend of her late husband, Mike Todd, igniting one of the biggest scandals of the decade. Then came divorce, then Richard Burton, then another divorce, and another marriage to him again. 8 marriages, 8 heartbreaks. And yet, when asked about love, she always smiled and said softly, "There was someone who made me believe in true love, but I let him go." She never said his name. She didn't have to. In 1973, at the Academy Awards, fate placed them under the same roof once more. Taylor walked on the stage to present an award for The Sting, the very film starring Paul Newman. As she read his name, her voice quivered. Newman, sitting in the front row, looked up and smiled. That same gentle, controlled smile that once tore her apart. After the ceremony, she stood backstage, watching him disappear into the crowd. She didn't call his name. Perhaps she knew that some stories aren't meant to be rewritten, only remembered. Years passed. Newman grew old beside Joanne, his marriage lasting more than 50 years, an eternity by Hollywood's measure. Elizabeth, meanwhile, continued to live between light and shadow, her heart still keeping one quiet secret. In 2007, when asked in an interview, if you could change one thing in your life, what would it be? She paused for a long moment before replying, "I wouldn't let him walk out of that room." The interviewer didn't ask who. They didn't have to. 4 years later, in her final interview for PBS, frail but radiant as ever, Elizabeth Taylor was asked, "Of all the people you've known, who is the one you most regret?" She gazed out the window for a long time before whispering a name, "Paul Newman." The interviewer hesitated. His name had never appeared in her stories before. Then, softly, she said, "Because I never told him that I loved him." No tears, no drama, just the calm of someone who had carried a beautiful torment for a lifetime. "He was the only man who ever made me fear myself," she added. "I was afraid that if I said it, I'd stop being me." It wasn't a confession. It was a farewell. One final act of honesty from a woman who had lived every kind of love except the one she could never claim. A year later, in 2011, Elizabeth Taylor passed away peacefully at 79. Among her keepsakes was a single photograph, a behind-the-scenes shot from Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. She's laughing. He's looking at her. Unaware of the camera, for more than 50 years, she never let anyone touch that picture. Because some loves don't need a beginning or an ending, they only need to exist. quietly, eternally, between two people brave enough to feel, yet too wise to cross the line. Paul Newman and Elizabeth Taylor never spoke of it again, but when she took her final breath, she left behind the one truth that outlived every scandal, every marriage, every role, that the greatest love stories are often the ones the world never sees. In the end, Elizabeth Taylor's story isn't just about beauty, fame, or even heartbreak. It's about something far rarer, restraint. Because sometimes the greatest proof of love is silence. For more than half a century, two of Hollywood's brightest stars carried a secret that could have destroyed everything they built. Yet they chose dignity over desire, conscience over comfort, and silence over scandal. Paul Newman spent the rest of his life as a man defined by loyalty to his craft, his wife, his values. Elizabeth Taylor lived as the embodiment of passion, a woman who burned brightly, loved fiercely, and left behind a world that could never forget her. And somewhere between them, in that one quiet night in 1958, lay a love story too pure for Hollywood's spotlight. When Taylor's biographer once asked her why she kept that photograph of Newman by her bedside for decades, she smiled and said, "Because some memories don't belong to the world, they belong to the heart." A secret love that lived only in silence and yet somehow has outlived them both. If you too believe that behind every dazzling Hollywood smile lies a story of fear, love, and sacrifice, then remember to like, share, and subscribe. Because here, we don't just tell the stories of legends, we uncover the truth that made them human. Sometimes what makes a star immortal isn't the light they shine, but the flame they carry, even if it burns only once in a lifetime.